Good evening. I am Pastor Bob Uzzle from the Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church, Corsicana, Texas. Today is Sunday, July 19th, 2020. Hope everybody has had a wonderful day. I want to pay tribute to the late Senator George Mcgovern on his 98th birthday. It was on this day exactly 8 years ago, July 19th, 2012, that he celebrated his 90th birthday at a reception in his honor at the museum in Washington, D.C. When asked to express his thoughts on this awesome occasion, he replied without hesitation, "On to 100. At my age, it's better to look back at people who knew me on the way through, who still say nice things about me." He discussed a recent examination by a physician in his home state of South Dakota. He couldn't find a thing wrong with me, not with my heart, not with my head. I fell on the sidewalk some months ago and hit my head very hard. I was out of it for some time, but I think I've now bounced back, and I think as clearly as I always have. So let's do this again in about 10 years. Sadly, that didn't happen. It was a few months later that he entered a hospice in South Dakota and was unresponsive. I initially wrote an article for the Philaxis magazine in commemoration for his 90th birthday. But before the magazine went to press, I'd heard this on the radio, and the editor of the magazine, who lived in California, also heard it on the radio, and he sent me an email. "You may need to revise it and make it a memorial piece." And his worst fears were well founded, and that's exactly what I ended up doing. George Stanley Mcgovern was born on July 19th, 1922, in the Wesleyan Methodist Parsonage in Avon, South Dakota. His family moved to Mitchell in South Dakota in 1928. He graduated from Mitchell High School in 1940. He was an outstanding student, especially proficient in debate, and he won a scholarship to Dakota Wesleyan University in Mitchell. There he was no doubt influenced by the school's motto, "Sacrifice for Service." At Dakota Wesleyan, he met a fellow student named Eleanor Stegeberg. They were married on the 31st of October, 1943. They had 5 children: Anne Susan, Teresa, Stephen, and Mary, all of whom were born in Mitchell. His education was interrupted in 1943 by World War II. As a B-24 bomber pilot in Europe, he flew 35 combat missions, earned the Distinguished Flying Cross. He was known throughout his life as a liberal Democrat. He recalled that his co-pilot during that time was a conservative Republican. How did he feel about that? He could care less. As long as he did his job, that was all that mattered. Politics isn't important when you're in a war zone. After completing his military service, he returned to Dakota Wesleyan, where he graduated in 1946. He then spent a year at Garrett Theological Seminary in Evanston, Illinois, before transferring to Chicago's Northwestern University. He received MA and PhD degrees in history, and from 1950 to 55 he taught history and political science at Dakota Wesleyan. It was during this time at his alma mater, like many of us during our college years, we seek light and knowledge from various sources, not just the classroom. George McGovern became a Freemason. He was initiated as an entered apprentice on the 28th of September 1954, passed the degree of Fellowcraft on the 16th of November 1954, and was raised to the sublime degree of Master Mason on 21st of December 1954. That was in Resurgam Lodge number 31 in Mitchell. He maintained his membership in Resurgam Lodge to the end of his life. And shortly after he resigned from his teaching position, he received the 32nd degree of the ancient accepted Scottish Rite and Oriental Consistory in Yankton, South Dakota, becoming a sublime Prince of the Royal Secret on the 13th of November 1955. His devotion to the principles of Freemasonry, as expressed in the years of service, resulted in his being coronated a 33rd degree Inspector General Honorary to the Supreme Council, 33rd degree of the Southern Jurisdiction on the 23rd of October, 1969. He left the classroom in 1955 to become Executive Secretary of the South Dakota Democratic Party. He did much to revitalize this party in a largely Republican state. In 1956, he was elected to Congress, and in 1958, he was reelected. Then in 1960, he ran unsuccessfully for the U.S. Senate. However, he was soon appointed by newly elected President John F. Kennedy as the first director of the Food for Peace program and as special assistant to the president. In these roles, he was able to oversee the donation of millions of tons of food to developing nations. Now, during his time as director of the Food for Peace program, he had a meeting with Pope John the 23rd, a truly remarkable man who was later canonized and made a saint just a few years ago. But the Pope told this Methodist, he said, when you stand before your Maker, and he asked, have you fed the hungry? You will truthfully be able to say yes. He said he hoped this blessing from this great holy man would offset some of his many, many sins. And he was elected to the U.S. Senate in 1962, re-elected in 68 and 74. He represented America's heartland with distinction by serving on the committees on agriculture, nutrition, forestry, and foreign affairs, as well as the Joint Economic Committee. In both houses of Congress, he spoke out forcefully against American involvement in the Vietnam War and on behalf of American farmers and the dispossessed. In 1972, Mcgovern received the Democratic presidential nomination, the only South Dakotan ever nominated by a major party. He lost the election by a landslide to Republican incumbent Richard Nixon, who would resign 2 years later as a result of the Watergate scandal. You know, it's hard to lose an election anyway. It's got to be especially tough when you look back on it. You lost to someone who was later discredited. He had said that if the election had been in 74 instead of in 72, it would have been a piece of cake. And one of his campaign staff, Frank Mankiewicz, told People magazine 10 years later, I thought McGovern had the right issues. History has tended to bear him out. I never apologized for that campaign. All we did was lose an election. We didn't go to jail, none of us. No perjurers, no conspiracies to obstruct justice. And in 1974, despite the failure to carry his home state 2 years earlier in the presidential election, McGovern was reelected to the Senate from South Dakota. On election night, he learned that his 1972 campaign manager, Gary Hart, had been elected to the Senate from Colorado. A network reporter asked Hart if he felt the 1972 campaign had been vindicated. Hart replied, "Richard Nixon has been driven from office in disgrace, and George McGovern and I have been elected to the U.S. Senate." This right here is a copy of a very worn book right from the start by Gary Hart. At the 1972, no, pardon me, 1982 Texas Democratic Convention in Dallas, I met Gary and he autographed this book for me. And he served 2 terms in the Senate from Colorado, and then he's twice sought the Democratic nomination for president. The first time was in '84 when he was defeated by Walter Mondale. He looked like he was on the way to getting it in 1988, but when his campaign self-destructed and Gary Hart went down in a scandal, which may be the subject of another video. But anyway, in 1976, President Gerald Ford, a 33rd degree Mason, appointed George McGovern as a delegate to the General Assembly of the United Nations. Then in 1978, President Jimmy Carter named him as a delegate to the UN Special Session on Disarmament. After leaving the Senate in '81, he has been honored as a visiting professor at numerous institutions of higher learning. He served as president of the Middle East Policy Council from 1991 to 1998, when President Bill Clinton appointed him as ambassador to the UN Food and Agricultural Organization in Rome. In this position, he had done much to combat hunger. On the 9th of August 2000, President Clinton awarded him the Presidential Medal of Honor. Medal of Freedom, America's highest civilian honor. And this was, he credited not only George McGovern, but also Senator Bob Dole in the creation of the George McGovern-Bob Dole International Food for Education and Child Nutrition Program. They were very close friends, McGovern and Dole, and they worked together fighting hunger. Dole, by the way, was the 1996 Republican presidential nominee. He lost to Bill Clinton. And the 2 men would get together and rehash their political careers. But no matter how many times they replayed it, it didn't turn out any different. I mean, McGovern did not beat Nixon. Dole didn't beat Clinton. Nevertheless, some of life's blessings cannot be determined by electoral votes. As far as fighting hunger worldwide, their records are without equal, these bipartisan buddies. McGovern wrote a number of books. I have several of them in my library. One of them came out of a personal tragedy. Terry, my daughter's life and death struggle with alcoholism. It was on December 13th, 1994, that the body of Teresa Jane McGovern was found in an alley in Madison, Wisconsin. She died intoxicated. She was just in her mid-40s. She had been an alcoholic for many years. She had been in and out of treatment. She experienced periods of sobriety, one of which lasted for 8 years, but she relapsed. Her body was found in an alley behind a print shop in to the owner and one of the employees of this print shop who found her body. Interestingly enough, both of them had passed out flyers for her father during the 1972 Wisconsin primary. And he stated that the manuscript for this book was literally stained with tears. Knowing what it's like to lose a child, I can understand that very much. And alcoholics die every day. And the average Skid Row drunk, nobody pays any attention to them. But when the person comes from a prominent family, it's going to get people's attention. And they went public with it. The profits in the book have used to fund the Terry McGovern Foundation, which does research on alcoholism with special focus on relapse. They now have a treatment center in Madison, Wisconsin, named after Terry, for people with dual diagnosis of mental illness and substance abuse. And they hope maybe other families will be spared what the McGoverns had to go through. The third freedom is a book subtitled Ending Hunger in Our Time. The title comes from a speech by Franklin D. Roosevelt. And then along with Bob Dole and Donald E. Messer, he co-authored a book, Ending Hunger Now, a challenge to persons of faith. Out of Iraq is a practical plan for withdrawal now. The Essential America, our founders in the liberal tradition. And his most recent book that came out about a year before his death, What It Means to Be a Democrat. And all his books are well worth reading. And he recognizes not all Democrats agree on every issue. And he doesn't try to make them agree, but there are certain basic principles that he feel like Democrats should follow. Well, I'm not finding what I'm looking for. But one of the things Mcgovern is most famous for is his opposition to the Vietnam War. He was firmly convinced that he was right on that issue. And he realized there were some Democrats who strongly supported the war, such as Presidents John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Baines Johnson, and Vice President Hubert Humphrey, all of who were friends of his. And he stated in his book that if I meet them in that mystery beyond the grave, I will embrace them, even though they were wrong on the war. And this book was published in 2011, a year before his death. And the Mcgovern Center for Leadership and Public Service at Dakota Wesleyan University was constructed by Poots Construction of Mitchell, was dedicated on the 7th of September, or rather October 2006. Former President Bill Clinton, who managed McGovern's Texas campaign in 1972, gave the keynote address for the event, which drew a large audience, including the McGovern family, Dakota Wesleyan University students, faculty and staff, and campus guests from around the globe. Dr. Donald Simmons was the founding director of the Mcgovern Center. And the first courses in leadership and public service were offered there in 2007. And the friends who gathered at the museum on the 19th of July, 2012, 8 years ago today, did not gather so much to talk politics, but to commemorate McGovern's long history with the issue of combating world hunger. And there were a number of prominent people there. Number of toasts were given, and Illinois Senator Dick Durbin recalled McGovern campaigning against the Vietnam War, saying he was fed up with all these old men dreaming up ways for young men to die in war. Among the other news lawmakers raising a glass to McGovern were Democratic Senators Tom Harkin and Patrick Leahy, and Representative Dennis Kucinich. The late Senator Ted Kennedy's widow, Vicki Kennedy, was there. And on the Republican side, there was South Dakota Senator John Thune, showing bipartisan solidarity with his former home state colleague. Senator Bob Dole was unable to attend, but he will be, by the way, his birthday comes up in 3 days, and he will be 97. He was a year younger than McGovern, but he sent his greetings. And there can be no doubt that illustrious George McGovern, 33rd degree, was greatly inspired by Masonic principles in his many years of public service and humanitarian work. And so he left here October 21st, 2012, at the age of 90. Truly a great and good man. Sacrifice or service is the motto of Dakota Wesleyan University, and will express the motto of the life of George McGovern. Happy birthday. Have a good evening.